we need to have a chat about the high explosive or HE changes that have arrived in 1.13 to World of Tanks. Now, the scope of this video is to explain why and not what these changes are, so please visit the official Wargaming video that explains what these changes are before coming back. Link will be in the description. So please join me, 13 Disciple, as we discuss one of the many core gameplay loops in World of Tanks. And yeah, this video is heavily inspired by the fine folks at Extra Credit. You should definitely check them out. First, you need to understand the essence of every game, which is a core gameplay loop. This is something every game has in one way or another, and it looks like this. The game presents you with an objective or series of objectives. You then gather information and form a hypothesis. These are part of your mental model of the game and how to accomplish the objective the game presented you with. Then, you test your mental model with action. The action is received by the game system and run through the rules of the game, or game mechanics. The game then outputs the result of the action as output to the player. This feedback is observed and interpreted by the player. The player's mental model is updated with the new information, and then either the objective is accomplished and gets a new objective, or the player goes through the loop again by testing a new hypothesis. This loop happens on a macro scale, an intermediate scale, and a micro scale. The core loops at scale for World of Tanks look a little something like this. The macro scale looks like, I need to research tanks and modules to get to tier 10. An intermediate scale would be, in a match, I've got to destroy all enemies or capture the base to win. And on a micro scale, I need to destroy the tank that is right in front of me. Now, the gameplay loop in a match of World of Tanks can be broken down into an endless series of sub-goals. An endless series of sub-goals. A vast majority of player frustration can be attributed by a failure somewhere in this loop. There are many, and hang on a second, we're going to need bigger font. Many ways that World of Tanks could and should make the core gameplay loop better. Before we get bogged down in trying to fix the whole game, maybe fixing World of Tanks would make a great video series. Anyways, let's remember the reason for this video is to talk about HE rounds. The problematic part of this gameplay loop is the interaction between armor and shells. The objective is for a player to damage and destroy an enemy by using their knowledge of shells and armor. Once a player establishes what enemy is in front of them and the type of armor that enemy is wielding, they must choose the appropriate ammunition to damage that enemy. They select a round and test their hypothesis by shooting an enemy. They are then provided feedback like damage, no damage, ricochet, miss. The player must interpret if this feedback was a result of their plan or execution. Do they need to practice more, or do they need to come up with a new strategy? HE shells interrupted this loop by making armor knowledge unnecessary by both the attacker and the defender. As long as your gun was big enough, and just continually firing HE shells would eventually pepper down tanks at a fast enough rate that there was really no reason to stop doing it. On the receiving side, the heavy tank gave up mobility, gave up concealment and other characteristics to gain the survivability that comes with thick armor. This tanker's ability to angle their armor and play their class well is completely subverted by HE spam. The HE spam often rewarded the shooter without asking that user to have strong knowledge of armor or a good understanding of the purpose of different shell types at their disposal. Often they select one shell and shoot it until the match ended, occasionally doing really high damage with one shot, but never knowing or needing to know why. Imagine playing StarCraft and Zerg rushing your way through everything. It may not be the most powerful technique, but it might be all you're ever going to need. This created a system of high power to skill ratio, which made it into a first order optimal, or F.O.O, strategy. These are ways to play a game that aren't actually optimal, but are so much more powerful than the other things you can do at that point in your skill progression that you'll just simply use that tactic over and over again. While F.O.O strategies seem really useful to the player, they become problematic for designers. Players will latch on to a F.O.O strategy and do it over and over again until it's no longer tenable. The designer put in other techniques and strategies that are more powerful, but they require more skill to perform. They expect the player to keep climbing up this power ladder, but this does fail. When ability B is 20% stronger than ability A, but requires 3 times the skill to perform, this leads players to keep using the easier tactic for as long as possible, which results in either A, the game becomes routine and the player gets bored because they never get to experience any of the depth the game actually offers, or B, the player gives up. By the time their F.O.O strategy is no longer viable, there is a great deal of skill the designer expected them to pick up that they never did. They end up running into a brick wall as there's no strategy for them to pivot to. The HE gameplay loop here fails with the game's own rules. This makes the reward of selecting the best shell trivial, and after enough matches, very boring. And your opponent's ability to angle their armor becomes meaningless. The changes to HE shells address this issue while better defining their role in the gameplay loop we discussed earlier. Let's update your mental model now with the new system. HE shells are best used as kill shots on extremely low hit point tanks, or base resets as knocking a couple of hit points to get a reset at the expense of better damage is a good trade-off and is now effective for lower caliber guns. Finally, they're also put to good use on very thinly armored targets. This will reward good armor knowledge with higher than normal damage. There are 2 criticisms to the changes that I'd really like to try to address here. The first criticism is, how am I supposed to deal with super heavy armor I can't penetrate frontally, especially on higher tier vehicles? You'll be required to go back to your mental model and change the way you play. You'll need to study their armor models to develop new strategies. You may have other shell types that can damage these tanks. If not, then, to put it bluntly, you aren't meant to deal with them in their strongest locations, like side scrapers in the middle of buildings or hull down monsters on a ridgeline. So don't try to. You'll need to surrender the map control and either hope one of your teammates that has the tools to deal with one in its element will accept and overcome the challenge, or you'll have to wait for that tank to travel to a location where its strengths are less helpful, and you can take advantage of better positioning. Well, what about corridor maps and chieftains and 279Es? While HE spamming is not really viable anymore, addressing the HE spam problem highlights other problems in the game. The chieftain and the 279E, in my opinion, have problematic vehicle characteristics that enables them to overperform, which is exaggerated by the fact that they are mostly in the hands of really good players. On top of that, it may also accentuate problematic map design. So yes, you may have no choice except to face these tanks frontally or give up a full flank. And in some ways, that's by design. Now, you may want them to put the band-aid of HE spam back in the game in order to hide the festering wounds of vehicles that are simply too strong and maps that are unfriendly to certain vehicle types. Why not instead challenge the developers to fix those problems as well? The second criticism is revolving around derp tanks, as in vehicles designed to primarily fire HE. They'll have their performance characteristics nerfed and they'll be less efficient. Derp tanks are actually a balancing system for player skill. In fact, balancing player skill should be a video in its entirety. Let's use an example. It's a bit like the noob tube in Call of Duty. Now, the matchmaker in Call of Duty puts extremely skilled and experienced players into the same game as a player that just put the disc in for the first time. That sounds familiar. The only way to make the game engaging for either player is to give the new player something that grants them a lot of power for the low amount of skill required to use it. Hence, the noob tube. You won't see veterans use them as there are more efficient tactics available to them, but you will sometimes see new players delete a veteran. Without it, Call of Duty would turn into a meat grinder of veterans churning through new players until they quit. That also sounds familiar. The derp in World of Tanks operates in a similar fashion. And whether longtime tank players want to admit it, derp guns are actually healthy for the game, and you should appreciate their role for the community. I would argue that derp tanks, in a way, get better. Damage should be more consistent with the armor you hit. When a new player discovers they do way more damage hitting thinner armor, they'll start researching armor models, or at least start gunning for those little driver hatches on the front of the tanks. Soon, they'll realize that they can penetrate side armor more easily, encouraging them to set up for ambushes and flanking maneuvers. Making derp guns more sensitive to armor models encourages new players to develop the knowledge they need to operate other vehicles by rewarding flanking and armor knowledge, while still being forgiving as they'll still do higher HE damage than non-HE primary guns. This new system rewards players from deviating from their F.O.O strategy discussed earlier without actually requiring a substantially greater amount of skill. That said, I do firmly believe that the accuracy of these derp guns should still be improved. If a new player is aiming for a weak spot but is punished by accuracy RNG, especially when the enemy is merely 50 meters away, that makes the game frustrating and not fun or rewarding. Well, that's my argument on why the HE changes are good within the context of World of Tanks and a good core loop. We, as a community, need to take the time to really think through how all of the game parts fit together in order to deliver on the substance beneath a game's surface. When that substance is improved, it'll make all of the surface level elements even better. While there's a lot of core gameplay loop elements in World of Tanks that still need work, in my opinion, this is one of the loops that has just gotten better. If you found this video changed your mind, I'd really like to know in the comments below. Also, if you think other people would find this video helpful, make sure to share it with them. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. I'll see you in the next video.